Okay, folks, so our lesson is going to get broken up this way. We're going to review the writing process, and while we're reviewing, I'm going to introduce something new, and this is this idea of formal tone and informal tone. There's a Kahoot that I want you to do for formal and informal. It's really good practice. And then we will get into, I'm going to walk your hand, hold you through the assignment, okay? So let's jump into this. So the writing process is broken into steps. So whenever you are given a task to write, these are the steps that you do. Now, they might not take a super long time, but these are the steps. And I know some of you skip some of the last ones, but it's okay. I want you to at least know how to do it. So when you are writing, the first thing you do is you pre-write. This is going to be your assignment today, is I'm going to ask you to do pre-writing. This is where you plan your writing. After you plan your writing, you draft. That's when you actually write down a copy of your writing. After you've written a copy, you revise it. So that means you reread it. Maybe you take out sentences, you put other sentences in, maybe you swap the order. And then as a last check, you do for spelling, for grammar. When we get into publishing, that's when you turn it in. That's when you give it to your audience. Oftentimes in school, that just means that you give it to your teacher. What I have found is that a lot of students get stuck in this drafting stage because they're worried that their writing doesn't sound good enough. And the reality is that the very first time you write something, it's always going to suck a little bit, okay? Me too! I have a master's degree, and that means that I went to school for like 4 years, and then I went back for another 2 years. So even when I write something, it is littered with mistakes, but it is important to write it down to get your ideas down so that then you can revise it and edit it. It's designed this way, okay? It is like your first draft is supposed to be bad. That's why we call it a first draft or a rough draft. So let's talk about pre-writing because that's where we're going to focus most of the task today. So when you pre-write, there's a couple things that you can do. And this could include creating a list. This could include creating a mind map or a web of ideas. You could also write a collection of ideas in a different format. So for example, sometimes when I plan something, I might gather information and then just like dump it into a document. So what we're going to do and what I'm going to ask you to do is to make a list today. That's the type of pre-writing that we'll be working on. So let's just assume that you've got all your pre-writing done. Now you get into the actual writing, and we have to think before we start writing, what is the purpose for writing? Like, what's the prompt? Are we telling a story? Are we explaining directions? Are we sharing information? Are you expressing your opinion or something about yourself? Or are you trying to persuade somebody to think like you're thinking? The type of writing we're going to be doing is more about sharing information and expressing yourself. This is where the new stuff comes in. So we've talked about pre-writing steps before. That was just a nice little review from last trimester. When it comes to drafting, you also have to think about who your audience is because that determines what tone of writing you use. So whether or not you are writing in a formal tone or an informal tone. And you have to think about these questions. So is the person that you're writing for, do they know a lot about your topic? Do they like humor? Or do they like facts? Do they like longer examples? And how well do you know them? So these are certain questions that you can ask to help you determine whether or not it's formal or informal. I want you to think of it kind of like this. So when you write for your audience, it's like dressing for the occasion. So there's different looks that you have. There's different styles of formal, and there's different styles of informal too. let's take this another step further. Why does it matter if we're using formal or informal? The reason it matters is because it may be rude to your audience. So just like it might be rude to wear jeans to a wedding or pajama bottoms to an interview or a hot pink miniskirt to a funeral, using the right tone for your audience is a sign of respect, and it makes the reader feel heard and understood and respected. And it also makes you, the writer, look really smart. So that's why we're talking about tone, is it's about respect and it's about making you look good. Okay. Different types of writing. Let's look at some examples. So in a formal style, when is it used? For work and for school. You use bigger words, fancier words, and it's used to make the writer sound more informed, smarter. Okay. Informal, you would use it at home with friends, with family. Oftentimes you would use smaller words or slang or contractions. And you use it when you're comfortable with the audience. Another note on audience is that if somebody is in a position of authority over you, that would be formal. So if you are writing for a teacher, for a principal, for a boss, for an elderly person that you don't know, or a stranger, you default to formal. If it is a friend or family member that you know really well, that's when you can use informal. So here's some examples of formal and informal when it's being written. If you're writing like an email or a letter to somebody, you might start out with a good morning, greetings, sincerely, regards. If you're writing an informal, you might start with a hey, sup, what's cracking? And you might end with a bye, peace, deuces. The thing is if I am like leaving work and so is Mr. Kipper, the principal, I'm not going to say, yo, Mr. Kipper, deuces. I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say, bye, have a good evening. Okay. Now let's look at some examples of tone in writing. So these two things are saying like the same thing. One is formal and one is informal. So the formal way, here we go. It seems there has been some miscommunication regarding your birthday. The informal way of saying that might be, oops, my bad, I thought your birthday was tomorrow. So you can use a lot more slang when you're talking. Let's look at some other examples. Click, click. Okay. An informal, you might say they put up with their neighbors' love of plastic flamingos. The formal or the nicer way of saying that might be they tolerated their neighbor's decorating style. Or here's this one. She was busy during the day, but she made up for it by going to bed early. This is more casual as opposed to a formal way of saying this. She was preoccupied during the day, but she compensated for it with an early night. Now, I'm not telling you to just use a bunch of words that you don't know what they mean, but to be really intentional about not using contractions with formal writing. Okay, so to wrap this lesson up, remember that formal and informal writing, they're both important. They're both useful. This is not a lesson to bash on informal writing. You just need to know when to use them, and that depends on who your audience is. So let's do a little Kahoot and practice this.